My husband proposed an open relationship on a Thursday night, with a rehearsed smile, with my best friend's conversation still glowing on his phone. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I picked up my coat and walked out. I ended up in the first bar I passed, and chose the wrong stool, belonging to the wrong man on the worst night of my life. "You're in my seat," he said. Low, calm, the kind of voice that doesn't request, it declares. I turned, saw the suit, the eyes. The way he occupied the room like everything else was scenery, and I made the most reckless offer of my entire life. He accepted. I didn't know yet that he was Luca Savio, didn't know the weight that name carried, but my husband wanted open, so I opened it. I just never expected to lose myself entirely along the way. Chapter 1. Open Relationship. I was perched on the edge of the mattress, still wearing the dress I'd put on for dinner, Derek's phone unlocked in my grip. The only thought circling my head was that the silk was creasing against the sheets, and that worrying about wrinkles right now was absurd. But the mind clings to absurd things when the real thing is too sharp to hold. The screen showed a thread of messages, not some random exchange. Ashley's name sat at the top. Ashley, who had been my closest friend for a decade, who stood beside me the day we buried my father, who knew the 4 digits that unlocked my bank account. The conversation had images. It had audio clips. It had words arranged in ways that left zero space for innocent explanation. I didn't cry. I scrolled through every message the way I'd review a legal brief, methodical, thorough, line after line, with no hope of discovering some overlooked detail that might reframe the story. The story was already clear before I reached the bottom, and the cruelest part of certainty is that your body figures it out long before your mind catches up. Mine had been sending signals for weeks, maybe longer, and I'd simply refused to give those signals a name. Derek appeared from the hallway carrying 2 glasses and wearing a smile I'd learned to decode, the rehearsed one, the one he assembled in front of a mirror before conversations he knew would be difficult. It was the smile reserved for grand suggestions disguised as generosity. He extended a glass toward me with the careful choreography of someone presenting a peace offering right before naming the price, and I accepted it because I was thirsty, and because refusing felt unnecessarily theatrical. "I want to talk about where we are," he said, lowering himself onto the bed beside me with a deliberateness that turned the gap between us into something diplomatic. "I feel like we've hit a stage where we need breathing room, space to evolve. I've been looking into the idea of an open relationship, and I genuinely think it could be good for us, for both of us." I drank in small, measured sips while he spoke. His phone sat dark in my other hand, loaded with everything I'd already seen. He went on with the polish of a prepared speech. Autonomy, self-discovery, how loving someone differently wasn't the same as loving them less. Every sentence had the smoothness of a draft that had been edited several times until the edges disappeared. When he ran out of words, I set the glass on the nightstand. Then I placed his phone right beside it, screen up, Ashley's thread waiting just beneath the black surface. I met his eyes and asked in the steadiest voice I could manage, "Have you already started?" Derek's gaze dropped to the phone, then rose to my face, and he said nothing. That silence was the most truthful thing he'd offered me in months. It wasn't shock, it wasn't remorse, it wasn't confusion. It was the very particular quiet of a man caught mid-lie, running calculations on how to land. I knew that silence well. I was a lawyer. I'd watched defendants sit in it countless times. I stood without hurry, walked to the chair, picked up my purse, took the coat I'd hung there when I arrived, and put everything on with the brisk efficiency of someone heading out to a professional appointment. Derek called my name twice, the first time sharp with urgency, the second wrapped in that patronizing calm he deployed whenever he wanted to shrink a reaction before it fully formed. "Scarlett, I was trying to be honest with you." "You were," I said. The composure in my own voice caught me off guard. "Thank you for that." I walked out. No slammed door, no scene. I pulled it shut with a quiet, precise click, and in hindsight, that gentleness was the harshest thing I could have done. It robbed him of the fight that would have turned me into the irrational one. All it left behind was the clean, unmistakable sound of a decision. His apartment was in Tribeca. I covered 3 blocks with no destination, my heels striking the pavement in a steady, almost hypnotic cadence. The air hung thick, the kind that gathers weight just before a storm, and I inhaled it greedily because the apartment had smelled like Derek and I needed my lungs full of something that carried none of him. The bar was the 3rd door I passed, and I stepped inside because the light through the window was warm and because my legs had already chosen before my thoughts caught up. It was the kind of place that kept its voice low, subdued, dark-paneled walls, the sort of amber glow that lent everyone a layer of intrigue they probably didn't earn in daylight. I skipped the tables, went straight to the counter, and claimed the first open stool. Only after I'd sat and flagged the bartender for a glass of wine did I notice that the stool beside mine wasn't vacant. A man occupied it, or, more precisely, a man's presence occupied it, which is an entirely different thing. He was angled toward the bar, a glass held loosely between his fingers, and I'd been so buried in my own wreckage that I hadn't registered him until I was already seated. "You're in my seat." The voice was low, unhurried, delivered like a fact that required no discussion because the conclusion was self-evident. It wasn't an ask. It wasn't a grievance. It was the sort of statement made by someone so accustomed to compliance that even telling you to move felt like an unnecessary effort. I turned to face him. He had the kind of presence that claimed the air around him without a single gesture, composed, exact, wearing a dark suit that draped the way expensive fabric does when it has nothing to prove. But the suit held my attention for barely a moment. What kept it were his eyes, meeting mine without any hurry, carrying a focus that made me feel as though I'd stepped into a room where someone had been waiting for me to arrive. "It was empty," I said, because it had been, and because courtesy toward strangers wasn't something I had left in me tonight. It was reserved. "There's no sign." His gaze flicked down to the counter for a fraction of a second, and I could have sworn something close to amusement passed through that movement, brief, nearly invisible, the kind of detail you only catch when you're watching closely. And I was watching closely, because my mind had nothing better to occupy itself with. "A reserved seat doesn't require a sign," he said, and when his eyes returned to mine, they stayed a beat longer than politeness would dictate. Not intrusive. Something worse. Assessing. The way someone who reads people for a living studies a new variable before deciding how to handle it. The bartender set my wine down. I picked it up, took a deliberate sip, and gave myself the pause I needed to avoid saying something I'd regret in 5 minutes. "Listen," I said, angling slightly toward him, glass in hand. "I've had an awful night. I have no interest in being relocated, and there are at least 7 perfectly available stools along this bar. Is it possible for you to pick one without inflicting permanent harm on your ego?" He didn't answer right away. He studied me for 3 full seconds. I counted, with that still undivided attention that was beginning to bother me in a way I couldn't quite pin down, because real irritation usually cuts sharper than whatever this was. "Awful night," he echoed, as though testing the weight of the words. "Or a reckless choice?" I opened my mouth, closed it, took another sip. The two aren't mutually exclusive, and for the first time since I'd walked out of that apartment, something deep in my chest released a tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Chapter 2. I need a boyfriend. What do you need? He didn't move. That was the first thing I registered once the words between us ran out. The man with the supposedly reserved stool hadn't gone anywhere. Glass still in hand, gaze still aimed at the bar, as though my being there was simply a new element he was quietly deciding what to do with. I hadn't moved either, and what that said about my state of mind was something I chose not to inspect too carefully. The bartender topped off my wine without being asked, and I was silently thankful because I needed an occupation for my hands while the quiet between us settled into something that wasn't awkward but wasn't nothing either. It was the kind of silence that carries weight. "You were expecting someone," I said, not a question. He'd glanced at the door twice since I sat down, and that was answer enough. "I am," he replied, and the gentle correction of tense was small but deliberate, a way of letting me know the exchange wasn't over just because I'd tried to dissect it. "And they're late." "They're always late." He turned the glass between his fingers in a slight, almost mechanical rotation. "That's what happens when you deal with people who treat punctuality as optional." I studied him from the corner of my eye. There was something in the way he said "deal with that" stretched the phrase wider than its surface meaning, and I couldn't have explained why at the time, only that my brain flagged it the way it flags things it doesn't yet understand, but intends to revisit. "What kind of business has you sitting in a bar at 11 at night waiting for someone?" He turned to me. That look again, whole, patient, carrying an attention that was neither rushed nor rude, but somehow worse than both. It was the look of someone trained to hear what goes unspoken, and to find that far more valuable than what's actually said. "The kind that doesn't get discussed in bars," he answered, and there was the faintest curve at the edge of his mouth, something I decided to label as irony, before I risked calling it anything else. The wine was doing its quiet, steady work, the work it does when your mind is too overloaded to resist, undoing one knot at a time, gently, without announcement. I was halfway through my second glass. Derek was 3 blocks and an entire reality away, and Ashley was somewhere out there being exactly who she'd always been, while I'd simply never looked hard enough to see it. I sat with that thought for a moment, Ashley, the messages, the voice clips, and felt a particular kind of vertigo that has nothing to do with alcohol. It's the vertigo of betrayal when it finally settles into your bones. Derek's betrayal stung in a way I could file and categorize. Ashley's hit somewhere language hadn't mapped yet. "You did it again," said the man beside me. I looked over. "Did what?" Disappeared from the conversation. His eyes were still on the bar, but the observation carried perfect clarity. "About 20 seconds. You were gone. I'm right here. Physically." A brief pause. "Your mind went somewhere to work something out." I should have found that invasive. Should have shut it down with a polite frost and relocated to another seat, which is exactly what any sensible woman alone in a bar would do when a stranger starts reading her silences with that kind of surgical accuracy. Instead, I took another sip and accepted that good judgment had clocked out for the night, along with my marriage. "My husband proposed an open relationship tonight," I said, eyes on the glass, "with my best friend of 10 years. Except it wasn't really a proposal. He'd already started. I was just the last to find out." He was quiet, not the silence of someone groping for words, the silence of someone genuinely listening. Most people don't understand how vast the distance is between those two things. "And you walked out," he said after a moment. "I walked out, without raising your voice, without raising my voice. A beat. Why?" I considered the question honestly, because it earned that. Because yelling would hand him the reaction that lets the guilty person play the victim. I'm a lawyer. I know exactly how that works. He glanced at me sideways, and something in his attention shifted. It was no longer assessment. It was closer to genuine curiosity, and that was inconvenient in a way I didn't yet have the words for. "Smart," he said, with a plainness that didn't feel like flattery. It felt like a clinical observation. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the night itself. Maybe it was the fact that I'd just watched a decade of friendship disintegrate on a backlit screen and my brain was running on fumes and adrenaline. But something inside me performed a fast, reckless calculation, and before I could talk myself out of it, the words were already leaving my mouth. "I have an event next week," I said, shifting toward him slightly, glass in hand, arranging my posture into the shape of someone making a perfectly rational business proposition, which was, physically speaking, a masterful lie. "A dinner, colleagues from my firm, a few clients, and my husband, who will be there because he works in the same circles and because the universe has a vicious sense of humor. I need someone to walk in beside me and make him choke on his own tie just by standing there. You look like the type." He didn't answer right away. His body angled toward mine, barely, almost undetectably, and he studied my face with that thorough attention again, as though reading something I hadn't realized I was writing. It wasn't rushed. 3 solid seconds of measured silence, and I felt the foolish urge to fill the gap with more words, but I held it back, because adding anything now would be confessing I was nervous. And I wasn't nervous. I was being reckless. Different thing entirely. "How much?" he said at last. I blinked. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" "A favor. You show up, stay a couple of hours, leave. No payment. Everything comes at a cost," he said, with a steadiness that made the words land heavier than they appeared. I opened my mouth to counter, and found nothing there. He was right, and the worst part about someone being right at exactly the right moment is the very specific silence of concession that follows. He watched me for another second, then looked at his glass, then at the door, as if weighing factors I had no access to. And then he spoke with the same flat precision of someone reading a clause out of a contract. "Thursday. Thursday," I echoed, because I needed to confirm I'd heard what I thought I'd heard. "Send the address." He set his glass on the bar and drew a card from the inside pocket of his jacket, sliding it across the wood toward me in one smooth motion. "To this number." I picked it up. It held nothing but a phone number. No name, no title, no identifying detail of any kind. I looked at him. "You're not going to ask my name? You'll include it with the address." And then a man materialized behind him, quiet, also suited, carrying the specific posture of someone practiced at occupying as little space as possible around certain people, and leaned in to murmur something I couldn't catch. I only heard the response, a minimal nod, and then the 2 words the man used before stepping back. "Don Savio." Half a second of silence. Mine. I stared at the card in my hand, then at the man beside me, who was rising from the stool with the unhurried calm of someone who had never rushed toward anything in his life. He looked at me one final time with those eyes that decoded what I didn't say, and this time there was something in them that bordered on amusement, and I couldn't decide whether that irritated me or unsettled me, because both options were equally inconvenient. I should have handed the card back. Should have apologized for the absurd proposition and taken a cab home with whatever shred of dignity I still had. Instead, I held on to it while Luca Savio crossed the bar toward the man waiting for him, and the only coherent thought my mind could assemble was that I had just struck a deal with the Don of one of the most dangerous families in the city, and that even knowing this, I felt no regret, which revealed far more about my night than I was prepared to acknowledge. Chapter 3. You're dangerous. You're asking me for a favor. Luca Savio entered the days that followed the way unavoidable things do, without invitation, without warning, but with a steadiness that made it impossible to write off as chance. Monday, a dark sedan was parked on the street below my building when I stepped out for work. Plates I didn't recognize. Driver staring straight ahead with the trained stillness of someone whose job was to go unnoticed. I wouldn't have given it a second thought if the exact same car hadn't been idling at the curb outside my office when I left at 7 that evening. Same plates, same rigid posture behind the wheel. For a coincidence, it was far too deliberate to be one. Tuesday, a table appeared reserved at the restaurant where my partner and I had our weekly lunch, a corner spot with a clear line of sight to the door, which stayed unoccupied the entire meal while I ate and pretended not to notice. The maitre d' mentioned the guest had canceled. I didn't bother asking for a name, knowing it wouldn't change anything. Wednesday morning, I texted the number on the card. No greeting, no pleasantries. The car, the table, explain. The reply came in 4 minutes. Precaution. I stared at the screen for a beat, then typed, "Be here at 12:30. We need to talk before the event." 1 minute later, "I'll be there." He walked in at 12:29, sat across from me with the composure of a man who had never owed anyone an explanation, and was about to offer one for reasons he was still privately weighing. I waited for the coffee to arrive before speaking. I wanted something to hold. "Precaution is a convenient word," I said, "but precaution implies a threat, and I don't recall requesting a security detail." "You didn't," Luca agreed, his low voice lending gravity to even the simplest statement. "I made that call. You have no right to make calls about my daily life." "I don't," he said, and the honesty in his tone was so unguarded it dismantled the argument I'd been constructing. "But I did it regardless." I held his gaze. "Why?" He sat in that dense silence of his for a moment, then answered with a directness that was almost aggravating in its clarity. "Because you walked into my bar, took my seat, made a proposition you had no business making, and left without grasping who you'd been talking to. That creates an obligation I never asked for, but it's there all the same." "You're dangerous," I said. "You're asking me for a favor," he replied. There was no rebuttal for that, so I offered none. The meetings to prepare for the public appearance, the label I'd settled on internally, because calling it anything else made the whole arrangement harder to contain, continued with an ease I hadn't expected, and the ease itself unsettled me, precisely because it shouldn't have felt so natural. There was a practical justification. We needed to know enough about each other for the story to hold up under casual questioning. How we met, how long we'd been together, enough consistency to survive small talk without contradictions. So we'd sit down, and I'd pose straightforward questions, and he'd answer with the verbal economy of someone who only reveals what's strictly required. And in the gaps between those straightforward questions, without either of us intending it, different conversations took root. He was funny. That was the first data point that refused to fit any profile I'd built for him. It wasn't the humor of someone performing. It was arid, unhurried, the kind that lands 3 seconds after delivery and catches you completely unprepared. He made a remark about wine one afternoon, and I laughed before I could catch myself. He looked at me with sharpened attention, as if that reaction held value, and he was cataloging it. "You didn't expect that," he said. "Expect what?" "For me to be funny. I didn't expect you to be anything beyond intimidating and single-syllabled." "I'm both of those as well," he said, and it was so plainly true that I laughed again. This time he didn't comment, just had that barely there curve at the corner of his mouth that I was beginning to recognize as his version of satisfaction. What he learned about me was that I wasn't afraid of him. This fascinated him in a way I could detect in the moments he tested, subtly, almost invisibly, with a pointed remark here, or a deliberate silence there, and I didn't flinch. It wasn't bravery. The fears I carried in that stretch of my life were far too internal, far too mine, for anything Luca Savio represented to compete. "Most people shift once they find out who I am," he said one afternoon, the coffee between us long cold, and neither of us having made a move to leave. "Shift how?" "They shrink, grow cautious, start measuring every word before it leaves their mouth." I considered that. "I measure every word before it leaves my mouth for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with you. Occupational habit." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it different." I didn't respond, but I felt those words settle somewhere inside me with a weight that wasn't unpleasant, and that was more dangerous than anything he'd said up to that point. The rehearsal dinner was his idea, a more formal setting, so that Friday's event wouldn't be our first test in front of an actual audience. Made sense, I agreed, and chose not to examine how little hesitation that agreement cost me. We arrived separately and met at the entrance. The first thing I noticed was that the pocket square in his jacket was folded wrong, a minor detail, the kind most people would never register, but that I cataloged with the automatic precision of someone who'd spent years in courtrooms learning that cases live and die in the details. It wasn't a conscious decision. My hand moved before my mind weighed in, fingers reaching for the pocket square, correcting the fold, smoothing the fabric against the lapel with 2 quick, practiced adjustments. My fingertips grazed the dark material, and when I looked up to check the result, I realized his chest wasn't moving. It wasn't tension. It was the specific stillness of someone who had stopped breathing without noticing, and I only caught it because my eyes happened to be exactly there, in exactly that second. I lifted my gaze to his face. Luca was watching me with an expression I couldn't name. Not surprise, not displeasure, something quieter and more layered than either. An attention that had shifted in quality, without my being able to pinpoint when, and that lingered a second too long to be dismissed by anyone with a shred of honesty. "Done," I said, my voice pitched 2 notes higher than usual. He answered. Nothing more. And he didn't step back. We stayed like that a moment longer than the situation called for. Too close for it to be accidental. Far enough apart that neither of us had to act on it yet. I was the one who moved first, turning toward the restaurant door, with a composure that cost me more than it should have. Across the plaza, unnoticed by either of us, someone raised a phone. The next morning, Clara, my other closest friend, the only one who hadn't betrayed me, sent a message at 7:43 with a photo attached and 3 exclamation marks before a single word. The photo was of us, shot from the plaza, at an angle clear enough to identify both faces without effort. My hand was still on his pocket square, and the space between our bodies was precisely the kind of space that gossip columnists describe as more than friendly. It already had 15,000 likes on a corporate tabloid account. I was mid-coffee when my phone buzzed with Derek's number. I let it ring out. He called again. I let that one die too. Then came a text. "We need to talk. Who is this man?" I looked at the photo for a long while, then at the message. Then I dropped the phone into my purse and finished my coffee, because Derek had had weeks to concern himself with what I was feeling, and had chosen not to bother, and that window had shut on a Thursday night with the quiet click of a door, except when I opened the app to clear the notification, and saw the photo once more, the closeness, the pocket square, the expression on Luca's face that the camera had frozen in that one lingering second. I understood the revenge had landed. The problem was that it no longer felt like just revenge. Chapter 4. You don't need to perform. I'm already here. The box was waiting at my door Thursday afternoon, propped against the wall with a restraint that didn't match its contents. No return address. Inside, black tissue paper folded with the precision that only comes when someone has been handsomely paid to be meticulous, and beneath it, a dark green dress that my fingers unfolded before my mind had any say in the matter. Structured shoulders, clean neckline, the kind of garment that never demands attention, yet commands it anyway, the kind that enters a room and forces everything else to rearrange. A note was tucked against the strap, for Friday, unsigned. As though a signature were necessary, I refolded the note, slipped it into a drawer, sealed the box with the dress still inside, and went to my closet to pick my own. Navy blue, straight cut, a piece I trusted because it had survived 3 events without a single failure. It was mine. I chose it. That was the entire point. I called Clara while applying lipstick. "He sent a dress," I said. "He what? I'm not wearing it. Scarlet, for the love of... I'm not showing up to a firm event in a dress from a man I've known for 2 weeks. An event I'm already using as personal revenge. That flips the whole power dynamic." "Remind me what the power dynamic was again," Clara asked, in the tone of someone who already knows the answer will be entertaining. I hung up. Navy blue. Mine. Final. Luca was in my building lobby at 8 sharp, and when the elevator opened I spotted him before he spotted me. Black suit, dark silk tie, that presence I still hadn't found adequate language for without sounding like someone paying too much attention. He lifted his gaze as I approached and did that thing with his eyes, top to bottom, complete, unhurried, and when they reached the navy blue, they paused for a beat before returning to my face. He said nothing, simply shifted to let me pass toward the exit, and I read the silence as acceptance, and moved forward with the settled certainty of someone satisfied with her own choice. The pool at the Seagram building had that cinematic glow. Low amber light, the skyline stretched behind glass, white flowers on the tables, 200 guests arranged in hierarchies that were invisible and absolutely real. The entire room had been dressed in shades of green and gold, from the centerpieces to the banners draped along the pillars, and the dark green dress folded in the box at home would have slipped into this palette in a way that the navy blue, perfectly correct in any other setting, simply could not. I understood this within the first 30 seconds. I said nothing. I would never say anything. Luca's hand settled on my waist as we walked in. It wasn't tentative. It was firm, warm, carrying a deliberate pressure that communicated something he hadn't spoken aloud, and that I received with absolute clarity. The hand of a man who doesn't touch anything carelessly, who decides first and acts second, and who was saying with that single gesture something that rendered any performance beside the point. I held my smile for the room, kept my stride even, maintained every surface I needed to maintain, while inside, my mind did that maddening thing of going blank at the precise moment I needed it most. "You don't need to perform," he murmured, his voice low near my temple as we greeted the first cluster of acquaintances. "I'm already here." I didn't answer, because every possible reply would have exposed something, and because he was right in a way I wasn't prepared to acknowledge out loud. Luca spoke sparingly, and watched constantly, and had a way of tilting his head during conversation that made whoever stood before him feel like the only person in the room. I observed this with a blend of admiration and unease, the recognition of a rare ability, and realized over the first hour that he was doing the same thing for me, building a perimeter, managing the room, intercepting difficult exchanges before they could reach me, not overtly, in the way only people who truly know how do it. "Derek is on your left," he said, leaning slightly toward me, lips close to my temple, his voice too quiet to travel beyond us. "Don't look yet." I didn't. I kept my eyes ahead, my smile steady, my breathing measured, which required real effort, because his cologne was inches from my skin and had made a unilateral decision to engrave itself into my memory without anyone's consent. "When?" I asked, quieter than I'd intended. "When he's already seen you first." A pause. 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then, "Now." I turned. Derek stood about 8 meters away, glass in hand, and it took him 2 seconds to reassemble his expression into something meant to pass for indifference. But I was a lawyer. I spent my days decoding what people didn't say, and what my husband's face revealed in that unguarded second before composure arrived was the unmistakable look of a man who had realized, too late, that he'd released something he should have held on to. His gaze moved to Luca, then to me, then to Luca's hand on my waist, which had not shifted once. The revenge was silent, surgical, and utterly devastating, and the most honest corner of my mind admitted there was something beyond the plan at work here, that the hand, the proximity, and those 15 calculated seconds of waiting had been real in a way that complicated things I would have preferred to keep uncomplicated. "Luca, darling, it's been ages." The voice arrived from the left, smooth and edged at once, the kind that smiles while doing something else entirely. The woman who approached was beautiful with full awareness of it, every element arranged for maximum impact, a smile that reached her eyes but didn't originate there. She pressed a kiss into the air beside Luca's cheek with the ease of someone who'd performed that gesture many times, then turned her attention to me, direct, frontal, with a gaze that catalogued, assessed, and filed me under temporary in under 3 seconds. Madison Vane was elegant the way blades are elegant, by the edge, not the ornament. "Aren't you going to introduce me?" she said, her eyes returning to mine with a warmth that was really an autopsy. "Scarlet Haze," I said before Luca could speak, because I didn't need anyone to present me, and the smile I offered was forged from the same steel as hers. "What a lovely name," Madison said, with the inflection of someone saying one thing and meaning something else entirely. "Do you work with Luca?" "She's with me," Luca said, with a plainness that sealed the question before it could breathe. And the hand on my waist, which hadn't left since we entered, which Madison had undoubtedly noted before anything else, tightened slightly. It wasn't a display. It was something quieter and more final than that. Madison smiled. Slow, measured. "We should catch up later, Luca. Loose ends. There always are," he replied, with a neutrality so exact I couldn't extract a single thing from it. She drifted away with the smile still intact, and I stood staring at the space she'd vacated, feeling something I flatly refused to name, because jealousy over something that wasn't mine was a complication my life had no architecture to support right now. "Who is she to you?" I asked, my voice pitched low enough not to carry. Luca looked at me and stayed silent. It wasn't the silence of someone without an answer. It was the silence of someone who has one, and is calculating how much of it to expose. And that particular silence, I knew from both profession and lived experience, was an answer on its own, just not the one I needed to hear. I left alone half an hour later. He didn't try to stop me, and I didn't glance back. The cab smelled like nothing, and the apartment was going to smell like quiet, and I knew all of this before I went anyway. The dark green dress sat in its box on the dresser when I got home. I walked past it without slowing, straight to the bathroom, turned on the water, and stood under the stream long enough for Luca Savio's cologne to wash out of my memory. It didn't. Chapter 5. The Fall. I slept terribly, not the restlessness born of worry or nerves, the kind that comes from too much awareness, when the brain decides that tonight is the ideal moment to revisit, frame by frame, everything it quietly stored during the day. The hand on my waist, the cologne, the 15 seconds before I turned toward Derek, Luca's silence after I asked about Madison, that dense, deliberate silence I'd read as an answer, and that remained an answer. I just didn't know yet which question it was really answering. I was awake by 6 with the sharp-edged lucidity of someone who hasn't rested, and I got out of bed because staying horizontal only gave my thoughts more runway. I brewed coffee. I stood at the window cradling the warm cup, looking down at the street, and the dark sedan wasn't there. The fact that I'd checked told me something about my condition that I chose not to investigate further. I reached the office by 8, and buried myself in the case that had been devouring my week. For 3 solid hours, my mind stayed exactly where it belonged, inside the files, the clauses, the arguments I was assembling with the kind of focus that crowds everything else out. It was a relief while it lasted. Derek appeared at 11. He hadn't called ahead, which meant he knew I wouldn't pick up, and that accurate reading of the situation annoyed me out of proportion because it proved he still understood me well enough to predict. The receptionist's voice came through the intercom, carrying the careful texture of someone relaying information she'd rather not be relaying, and I told her to send him in, because the alternative was a hallway spectacle I refused to gift the firm. He walked in wearing a smile, not the open relationship smile. This one was different. It was the reconciliation smile, the second chance smile, the kind wrapped in what looked like genuine remorse, a sincerity Derek could manufacture with a conviction that had taken me years to recognize as rehearsed. He paused near the door before approaching, as though testing the room's temperature. "We need to talk," he said. "Go ahead," I replied, eyes still on the file for 2 more seconds. Then I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, because what was about to happen deserved my full attention. Derek dropped into the chair across from my desk and ran a hand through his hair, the gesture I'd learned to associate with confessions, and then he spoke. Fluently, with the polish of someone who'd prepared every line but wanted it to sound unrehearsed, that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd underestimated what we had, that seeing the photo on the gossip pages had hit him like ice water and shown him exactly what he was about to lose, that Ashley had been an error, that he wanted to begin again. I listened to every word, with genuine attention, no interruptions, without the guarded expression he was probably bracing for. I let each sentence settle into its proper place before I responded, because I was a lawyer, and I knew the strongest answer always comes after hearing everything, not from impulse. When he finished, he sat in silence with his eyes fixed on me, and there was something in them that approached real hope. That was the saddest part of all, that Derek was capable of real hope at a moment when hope no longer served any purpose. "You only want me now because someone else does," I said, with a calm that took no effort because it was simply the truth. "That tells me everything I needed to know about you. Not about what you feel, about how you operate, and I can't build anything on how you operate." He opened his mouth. I stood. "Thank you for coming to say this in person. Close the door on your way out." I reopened the folder, because there was work to be done and nothing left to discuss. The silence he carried with him when he left was clean in a way I hadn't expected, and it left me sitting for a long moment with both hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, just breathing. I left the office at 7 with my briefcase and coat, and the stacked fatigue of a week that had been long in ways that had nothing to do with billable hours. The cab let me off at the building entrance. I rode the elevator up with my mind already dimming, planning dinner and a bath and the 8 hours of sleep my nervous system was owed. The apartment door was open, not forced, no splintered frame, no broken lock, just open, slightly ajar, with the living room light glowing inside as though someone had walked in, done what they came to do, and left, without hurry. I stood in the hallway for 3 seconds, key in hand, professional instinct telling me not to enter before assessing. I entered anyway, because that night, pride outranked instinct. Nothing was torn apart, nothing broken, nothing missing, nothing displaced. The spare purse sat on the chair, the laptop on the table, the jewelry on the dresser exactly where I'd left it. Whoever had been inside hadn't come to take, they'd come to leave. I saw it on the hallway mirror. written in what appeared to be red lipstick, my lipstick, which I recognized by the exact shade, removed from my purse and returned with the cap closed to the bathroom shelf, was a message in large, even, unhurried letters. Be careful who you choose to impress. I stared at those words for a stretch of time I couldn't quantify. It wasn't a frantic threat. It was worse. It was the composure of someone with all the time in the world who wanted me to understand that. Someone who had entered, located the lipstick, written this with the deliberateness of a person delivering a message that needed no signature to be understood, and left pulling the door gently shut behind them. I should have called the police. That was the rational answer, the objectively correct one, the answer any person with legal training and basic common sense would arrive at. I picked up my phone. I stared at the screen. 15 minutes later, without having called anyone, the doorbell rang. Luca stood in the hallway, still wearing the day's suit, his face carrying that expression I'd learned to recognize as him processing far more than he was showing. He looked at me for a second, quick, assessing, the kind of glance that checks for damage before anything else. Then his eyes shifted past me to the apartment's interior. I'm fine, I said. I know, he said. Then why are you here? He didn't answer right away. He stepped inside, because I'd moved away from the door, and for a man like Luca Savio that was permission enough, and walked straight to the hallway where the mirror hung. He stood before the words for several seconds, hands in his pockets, with a stillness that was more unsettling than any visible reaction could have been. I went to the living room and sat on the couch because my legs had decided for me. Then I looked at him in the hallway and said what needed to be said. You weren't called. I didn't contact anyone, which means you knew before I did, and that means this apartment is being watched. A pause. By you. Luca left the hallway and came into the living room and stopped 2 meters from me with that presence that made everything around it shrink. He looked at me with an honesty more disarming than any excuse could have been. Yes, he said. Nothing else. I should have been furious. I had every justification, every argument, all the legal vocabulary necessary to take this apart in record time. Instead, I sat there with my pulse racing in a way that had nothing to do with anger, and that was far, far worse than any version of fury I could have summoned. Since when? I asked. Since the night at the bar, he said, and the silence that followed was the heaviest that had ever hung between us. Chapter 6. I don't usually explain my reasons. The silence stretched long enough for me to count to 8 in my head, and still have seconds to spare. Luca stood 2 meters away, hands in his pockets, carrying that stillness I'd come to understand wasn't emptiness. It was restraint, the particular stillness of someone with a great deal happening beneath the surface who had decided, at some point in his life, that letting it show cost more than it was worth. Since the night at the bar, I said again, because sometimes hearing a thing out loud helps arrange what the mind can't organize in silence. You've been watching me since the night we met. Yes. Without my permission. Yes. I should have reached for my briefcase, pulled open the door, and asked him to leave with every ounce of precision that years of legal training had given me for shutting down conversations without appeal. I should have. Instead, I sat on the couch with my hands folded in my lap, looking at him, and the outrage I was trying to summon didn't arrive with the force the situation technically warranted, and that frustrated me more than the surveillance itself. Sit down, I said, because if he was going to stay, he was going to do it without making me tilt my head upward. He lowered himself into the armchair across from me, unhurried, without the air of someone who just gained ground. He simply sat, as though it were the most natural motion in the world, and held me in that thorough attention I'd learned to recognize as his way of listening before everything else. Madison, I said, either you explain who she is, or I'll sit here constructing theories, and I'm too skilled at that for the theories to be comfortable for you. Luca was quiet for a beat, not avoidance, but selection, the care of someone who understands that words carry weight and refuses to spend them carelessly. Then he spoke, in that low, unadorned voice of his. My brother died 4 years ago. He had a daughter. She's 7 now. The mother vanished when the girl was 2. Madison has been the legal guardian ever since, not out of love, out of calculation. She grasped early on that the child was the only leverage that worked with me, and she's wielded it with the precision of someone who mapped every move in advance. A brief pause. I tolerate her, because that's the cost of access, nothing beyond that. I listened without interrupting, weighing every detail, and when he finished I stayed quiet for a moment, because there were layers in that story that needed time to settle. It wasn't the narrative I'd imagined. It was heavier, older, threaded with a kind of pain that never surfaces but quietly shapes everything around it. You could have told me this at the event, when I asked. I don't usually explain my reasons, he said. I know, you've made that clear. I held his gaze. But you're explaining now. He didn't reply immediately. He just returned my look with that attention whose quality had shifted since the bar. I knew it had shifted, but I lacked the vocabulary to describe it without sounding like someone who'd been paying too much attention and had arrived at conclusions that redrew the boundaries of everything. "I am," he said at last, plain, unadorned, as though the absence of elaboration was itself the point. I went to the kitchen for water because I needed a moment outside his line of sight to breathe without restriction. When I returned, he was still in the armchair, same posture, which struck me, for reasons I couldn't entirely articulate, as a form of courtesy, Luca Savio's way of saying I'm not leaving without uttering a word. I settled back on the couch, took a sip, and then he asked, in that quiet voice that made any question feel weightier than it should, "Why didn't you cry when you found out?" I looked at him. It wasn't the kind of question I'd anticipated, and the fact that I hadn't anticipated it caught me without the armor I normally assembled before answering honest things, so I didn't assemble it. I just thought, genuinely, before I spoke. "Because I already knew," I said. Not the specifics, not Ashley by name, but the shape of it, that something was off, that what I'd been feeling wasn't paranoia, that my body had been telling me something my mind refused to articulate. I just needed the evidence to give myself permission to believe what I already knew. He was quiet for a long while, his eyes on me in a way I didn't look away from, because looking away now would mean retreating from something that had been real and deserved not to be retreated from. "That's the bravest thing I've ever heard," he said, very low. It wasn't performance, it was observation, the kind that comes from someone who doesn't spend words without intent, and it landed inside me with a gravity I wasn't ready for but absorbed anyway. I said nothing. There was no reply that wouldn't have diminished what he'd just given. He rose a few minutes later, and I stood with him because it was the natural choreography of goodbye. We moved to the hallway in a silence that was comfortable in a way I hadn't examined closely enough to know whether it was good or dangerous. Likely both. Luca paused in front of the hallway mirror, the lipstick words still scrawled across the glass. From the inside pocket of his jacket, he drew a folded handkerchief, the same exact gesture as always, and passed the cloth over the surface in 2 unhurried strokes until the message was gone. He said nothing about it, tucked the handkerchief away, turned to me, and in that wordless act, there was more protection than in most of the language I'd heard in my entire life. We reached the door. I opened it. He stopped on the threshold without crossing, as though weighing whether anything remained to be said. I stayed on my side with a hand on the knob, trying to recall what I'd meant to say before he arrived. Something about tomorrow's caseload, about needing sleep, about anything practical that would wrap the night in a shape I knew how to label. I turned to say it. He was already looking at my mouth, not in haste. With that complete attention again, still, total, the kind that doesn't ask permission because it doesn't need to, because attention of that caliber is already a declaration on its own. I forgot what I was going to say, not partly. Forgot, as if the sentence had never formed in the first place. "You're doing this on purpose," I said, my voice quieter than intended. "Doing what? Looking like that?" "Yes," he said, "just that." No excuse, no deflection, no trace of the faint curve at the corner of his mouth. Just yes, direct, the way true things are spoken when the person has no patience left to dress them in anything else. He raised his hand and placed it on my face, slowly, one finger first, brushing the hair from my temple with a deliberateness that made every millimeter of the gesture impossible to overlook. His thumb came to rest along the line of my jaw for a full second, as if honoring a decision that had already been made but still deserved that pause. "Luca, I know," he said, and then he kissed me. It wasn't forceful. It was worse. It was precise. The way everything Luca Savio did was precise. His hand cradling my face as though I were something he'd decided was his, and was confirming it without any rush. Every movement carried intent. Nothing in it was accidental, and the deliberation was more devastating than urgency could ever have been. I grabbed the lapels of his jacket without thinking, my fingers closing on the fabric as though my body had made the choice before my mind, which was becoming a troubling pattern with this particular man. When he drew back, just far enough for me to breathe, not a centimeter more, his eyes were dark, and his voice even lower than usual. I've wanted to do this for a while. I still had his lapel in my grip. I didn't let go. "Why did you wait so long?" "Because once I start," he said, his lips a breath from mine, "I won't want to stop." Inside the apartment on the coffee table, my phone screen was still lit. Clara had called 20 minutes earlier, and I'd answered and forgotten to hang up, and she had witnessed everything in perfect silence, without a sound, exercising a restraint entirely incompatible with her personality, and therefore enormously expensive. By the time the screen finally dimmed from inactivity, both her thumbs had been raised for a long time. Chapter 7. The deal was never just about the party. It was an unremarkable Tuesday when everything collapsed. And the cruelest thing about unremarkable Tuesdays is that they offer no warning. I was at my desk at 2 p.m, 3 cases open on the screen, coffee cooling beside the keyboard, when my partner Anne walked in carrying a thick folder and dropped it in front of me with the expression of someone who'd spent the morning doing work she wished she hadn't. New client, wants full confidentiality, fees wired in advance, and asked specifically for someone in corporate litigation. She tapped the folder twice. Tax complications across 3 different holdings, and a debt that materializes or vanishes depending on which document you're looking at. Should be a joy. She left. I opened the folder. The client's name was printed on the first page. Derek Cole. I stared at those 2 words for a stretch I couldn't measure, hit by the specific sensation of the ground making a movement you didn't anticipate. It doesn't give way, just shifts enough to remind you it was always there beneath you, and that you'd been trusting it without thinking. Anne had no reason to know. I hadn't told anyone at the firm about the marriage, the bar, or anything that had unfolded over the past weeks. The correct move was to close the folder and request reassignment. That was standard procedure, what any attorney with a declared conflict of interest should do before anything else. Instead, I turned the page. The debt appeared in the 3rd section, buried between financial statements and transfer agreements drafted in the kind of language engineered to obscure rather than clarify. But I was good at what I did, and what I did included locating precisely what someone hoped I wouldn't find. It was a liability tied to a holding company registered in Malta, incorporated 2 years prior, large enough to explain the erratic behavior of the other entities, and modest enough to survive a surface-level audit without raising a flag. The holding's name meant nothing on its own, but the tax identification number pointed to a 2nd document, and the 2nd led to a 3rd, and the 3rd carried in its footer a name I recognized before my conscious mind had caught up with my eyes. Savio Group International. I sat perfectly still for a full moment. Then I closed the documents one by one with the mechanical calm of someone using method as an anchor, because everything else is in free fall. I set the folder in the corner of the desk, picked up my phone, looked at Luca's number on the screen for 10 seconds, then dropped the phone back into my purse. This wasn't a conversation for a text message. I left the office at 3 without telling anyone where I was headed, which was unusual enough to earn a raised eyebrow from the receptionist as I passed. I didn't stop to explain. Luca's office address existed nowhere in the public record, a fact that was itself information. But I had his number, and from the back of the cab I sent a single message: "Need to see you. Now." 2 minutes later, 550 Madison Avenue, 12th floor. The building was understated the way genuinely expensive things sometimes are. No spectacle in the facade, nothing in the architecture that beckoned attention from the street, but a quality of materials and a total absence of wear that communicated everything it needed to. The receptionist knew my name on arrival and walked me directly to the elevator without a question, which meant I'd been cleared before I set foot inside, which meant Luca had read something in a 4-word message that told him the terrain had shifted. He was standing near the window when I entered. The city sprawled below, the dark suit, that posture that was never guarded but never careless. His eyes found me when the door opened and he stayed where he was. The heightened focus on his face confirmed what I already suspected. He knew what was coming. I set my purse on the nearest chair, crossed my arms, and spoke in the voice I reserve for the courtroom when there's no margin for nuance. Derek carries a debt with Savio Group International, a debt that's been in place for 2 years, structured to resist tracing, and substantial enough for the Savio family to have a direct stake in anything that touches Derek Cole's life. I paused, including his wife. Luca didn't answer right away. He held my gaze with that stillness I'd come to understand as something other than passivity. It was containment, the silence of someone calculating how much to confirm and how much to leave hanging. And it was that exact silence, more than any words, that told me I was right. "You knew who I was at the bar," I said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. The word dropped into the quiet of the office with a weight it shouldn't have been able to carry, and I stood there absorbing it with the composure I'd spent years training for moments precisely like this, when the information is what you expected and still cuts, because expecting doesn't shield you from the blade, it just changes the angle. Then what was I? In the plan. My voice came out lower than I'd intended. Leverage? A pressure point against him? Luca stepped away from the window and moved toward me slowly, and there was something in that approach that departed from his usual bearing. This wasn't the man who occupies space with effortless command. This was the man who is nearing something that matters and who understands that the next second will determine something that cannot be taken back. He stopped a meter from me. "That was the plan," he said. with a bluntness harder to absorb than any lie would have been. You were adjacent to Derek. I needed a point of entry, and I already knew who you were. What I didn't expect was for you to walk into my bar that night and make a proposition no rational person would make. I used that. A short pause, and then, a shade quieter. The problem is you didn't stay inside the plan. I held his gaze. What does that mean? It means the plan stopped being the plan long before I was willing to admit it to myself. He looked back at me with a transparency that offered no escape. I don't put surveillance on people who are instruments, Scarlett. I don't explain Madison to instruments. I don't stand outside broken into apartments waiting for instruments to open the door. There was truth in that. I could feel it. I recognized truth with the same accuracy I recognized deception, a skill built from training and instinct, and both were saying the same thing in that instant, which is precisely what made the moment harder, because it would have been simpler if he'd lied. With a lie, I'd know what to do. That doesn't undo what you did, I said. It doesn't, he agreed, without attempting to. I retrieved my purse from the chair. He remained where he stood, and there was in that stillness something that cost him. I could see it in his shoulders, in the set of his jaw, in the way his hands stayed motionless at his sides when the instinctive movement would have been to reach out. He was letting me leave because he'd decided that was what I needed, and that decision, which was the right one, was also the hardest thing to witness, because it told me something about him I wasn't prepared to know. I walked to the door, opened it, stopped on the threshold for a second without turning around. Why'd Derek's debt? I asked, still facing the hallway. What does he owe you? Money, Luca said behind me. Just money, which he'll pay. I left. The elevator descended in silence. The lobby was empty. A cab arrived in 3 minutes. I made the entire ride back with my hands in my lap, eyes on the window, my mind held in a stillness that wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a decision that hasn't landed yet, but is already on its way. The trouble with "you didn't stay inside the plan" was that I knew, with the same certainty I'd known everything else, that I no longer wanted to stay in it, either. Chapter 8. Madison knows everything, and she'll use it. The envelope arrived Monday morning at the office reception. No return address. My name written by hand in calligraphy that was lovely the way snares are lovely, crafted with care, designed to seem harmless before it closes. I opened it behind my closed office door, because something in the weight of the paper and the absence of a sender told me, before anything else, that the contents were meant for my eyes only. Inside was a dossier, photographs printed on heavy stock, documents time-stamped and dated, and a 2-page handwritten letter that opened with, "You deserve to know the truth about the man you're trusting." The photographs showed Luca, with Madison, different locations, dates printed in the margins, with the kind of proximity that narrates a very specific story. A hand on a shoulder in one, the two of them entering a hotel in another. A candlelit dinner at a table for two under the low light of people who'd rather not be seen. The dates were recent. Several fell within the last 2 weeks. The letter said, with a polish that didn't conceal the venom beneath, that Luca Savio had never ended things with Madison, that what existed between them was an arrangement spanning years, one that carried no official label because men like Luca didn't label things they preferred to keep open, that I was the most recent iteration of a pattern Madison knew intimately, that she was sharing this not out of malice, but out of solidarity between women. I read it all twice. Then I placed the dossier inside my desk drawer, locked it, and walked into my 10 o'clock meeting with my composure intact, my expression neutral, and my mind in that cold, quiet place I knew well, the place I retreated to when emotions grew too large to be useful, and I still needed to function. I functioned all day, efficiently, precisely. Behind the armor I'd spent years constructing for exactly this, for the days when the ground shifted and I needed to remain upright regardless. Before lunch, I reassigned Derek's case to Anne, with a brief note citing a supervening conflict of interest. No details, no drama. She didn't ask. I didn't elaborate. That same afternoon, I opened a blank document and began drafting the divorce petition. I didn't delegate it. I was a lawyer. I knew the terms, the timelines, and exactly what I wanted and didn't want to carry away from 3 years. It took 40 minutes. I printed it, signed as petitioner, and sealed it in an envelope with the same efficiency of someone closing a contract that should have expired long ago. The only strange thing was that it didn't hurt at all, or perhaps it wasn't strange. Perhaps I'd already grieved before I had permission. And this envelope was just the paperwork arriving late to formalize something that had ended on a Thursday night with the quiet click of a door. Only at night, alone in the apartment with a glass of wine I wasn't touching, did I let the armor ease enough to feel what lay beneath it. And beneath it was anger. Not the explosive kind, but the still, methodical kind. The kind that doesn't raise its voice, that organizes, that decides. It wasn't anger at Luca. It was anger at myself for having forgotten, for a moment, for several moments, that I wasn't the sort of woman who lost her balance over a man. I'd done that once. It had produced 3 years of marriage to someone who asked me for an open relationship with my best friend. I wasn't interested in collecting the sequel. I went to bed with the dossier still locked away, and the decision still unmade, because decisions assembled at night with wine on the table are reliably the ones I regret by morning. Luca appeared Tuesday afternoon. I hadn't answered his calls since Monday. 3 attempts. No voicemail, which was his version of restraint, because I knew a man like Luca Savio had far more effective ways of making himself present if he judged the situation demanded it. The fact that he'd waited until Tuesday was, by itself, data. The doorbell rang at 6. I opened it because the alternative was remaining inside knowing he was outside, and that was intolerable for anyone with my degree of pride. He stood in the hallway wearing the day's suit, and that expression I'd learned to read as awareness, not of what, specifically, but that something had changed, and that the change originated outside the two of us. He stepped in when I widened the door, no verbal invitation required, and moved straight to the living room with the silent familiarity that had settled between us, without either of us decreeing when. I retrieved the dossier from the drawer and set it on the coffee table without a word. He opened it, read, studied the photographs with an attention that wasn't the attention of someone exposed. It was the attention of someone evaluating the craftsmanship of an operation aimed against him, and there was in that a detachment that was simultaneously reassuring and chilling. When he finished, he closed the dossier and placed it back on the table with the same deliberateness he'd used to open it. "The photos are altered," he said. "The hotel is real. I was there for a meeting. Madison arrived uninvited, stayed 40 minutes, and left. What you see in these images was built from angles selected to tell the story she wanted told." "I know," I said. He looked at me. "You know, I'm a lawyer. Analyzing evidence is what I do for a living. The shadows in the photographs don't align with the stamped timestamps, and there are 2 frames where the reflection in the background glass contradicts what the foreground camera is showing." A pause. "But the fact that I can take it apart technically doesn't change what she intended, and it doesn't answer why she still holds enough power over your life to try." Luca was silent. That waited quiet again, and then he spoke, in his usual low, direct tone, but without the economy he normally applied when the subject was himself. "My niece's situation is still unresolved legally. Madison remains the official guardian, and as long as that doesn't change in the registry, I have to maintain a level of tolerance that costs me more than anything else in my life." He met my eyes. "I've been working on this for months. There's a legal proceeding underway. It should be settled within weeks. You could have told me this sooner. I don't share things like this with people who can still leave," he said. And there was in those words something that was vulnerability, not the performed kind, but the kind that surfaces when someone is exhausted from holding on and decides, in one precise second, to let go. The silence that followed was unlike any that had come before. It was more open, more honest, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled, but accepts whatever arrives. "And now?" I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "Now you know. I didn't leave. It wasn't a decision my mind made first. It was a decision my body arrived at, and my mind ratified after the fact." I stayed on the couch while he stood near the window, and we remained like that for a stretch that needed no words. And there was in that shared quiet something more intimate than most conversations I'd had in my entire life. "The girl," I said at last. "What's her name?" Something in his face shifted. Nothing dramatic. Subtle, quick, the kind of change you only catch if you're watching closely, and which revealed in that instant that there were parts of Luca Savio entirely immune to armor. "Sophia," he said, 7 years old, stubborn the way her father was. "Does she know you?" "She calls me every Friday to tell me about school. I answer no matter where I am or what I'm doing." A short pause, then, with that dry irony I'd come to recognize as his form of tenderness, "She's convinced I need supervision." I laughed. He watched me laugh, with that sharpened attention I already knew, the kind that catalogs and never wastes. And then the corner of his mouth yielded that minimal movement that was his version of a genuine smile, and there was in it something beautiful, in a way that caught me entirely off guard. I rose from the couch. I didn't move toward the door. I moved toward him, covering the 2 or 3 steps between the couch and the window, and stopped 1 pace away, with my eyes on his face, and the decision already made in some stratum deeper than conscious thought. "I don't know what I'm doing," I said, with complete honesty. "You kept things from me. You used me as a way into a situation that was yours, and I should be angrier than I am. The problem is that when you explain things, I believe you, and when you talk about Sophia, I can see you whole, and whole you are the most inconvenient problem that has ever walked into my life. He stayed perfectly still while I spoke, his gaze on me with that total, quiet attention that made it impossible not to say true things, because the alternative was wasting one of the only spaces in my life where truth cost me nothing. When I finished, he raised his hand and placed it against my face, palm warm on my cheek, thumb along my jaw, with that unhurried deliberateness that made every centimeter of the gesture impossible to overlook. His eyes held mine and stayed, and there was in them a still intensity, denser than anything I'd experienced with anyone before. "You're the reason the plan stopped existing," he said, his eyes on me with nowhere to hide. "And the reason I no longer make plans that don't include you." His apartment was silent in the way only meticulously kept spaces can be, a dense, refined quiet, the city outside and the world entirely suspended within. I'd been here once before, but this time was different, because this time I wasn't trying to leave. He removed his jacket the moment we stepped inside, and tossed it onto a chair in a single motion, then loosened his tie with his fingers. Slowly, his eyes on me the entire time, one knot at a time. And there was in that a deliberation nearly unbearable to witness, because every movement was intentional, and every intention was transparent, and I was standing in the center of the room unable to look away from a single second of it. "You're looking at me like I'm about to do something frightening," he said. "Are you? Depends on what frightens you." He approached. Slowly. Luca Savio was never in a hurry, and that absence of haste was the most disarming thing about him, because it turned every second of closing distance into something that demanded to be received with total attention, or lost entirely. I wasn't losing any of it. He stopped one step away, lifted his hand, and threaded his fingers through my hair, drawing it off my shoulder with a slowness that let his fingertips graze the side of my neck on the way down. A feather-light contact, seemingly incidental, that was nothing of the sort, and I closed my eyes for half a second. Just half. But he saw. "Scarlett, don't say my name like that." "Why?" "Because then it's hard to pretend this is still just an arrangement." He tilted his head, his lips a millimeter from my temple, and didn't kiss, just stayed there, breathing close, and the heat of his nearness was a physical thing I felt on the skin of my face, and in my racing pulse, and in the diminishing distance between us that was becoming less and less distance. "It was never an arrangement," he said, against my temple. When I turned my face to reply, his mouth found mine. It wasn't the careful kiss from the apartment doorway. This time he kissed with both hands, one open and warm on my face, the other at my waist, pulling with a firmness that didn't ask permission, because permission had already been given in the way I hadn't drawn back, in the way I'd turned toward him at exactly the right angle, in the way my hands went to his shirt before I registered they'd moved. It was everything that had been held in check, in the pocket square scene, in the 15 seconds before I turned to Derek, in the nights I'd lain awake with his cologne lodged in my memory, and the kiss carried the accumulated weight of all of it, which was immense. He pressed me against the wall without breaking the kiss for a single instant, one hand still on my face and the other on my hip, and I felt the heat of his body against mine like something I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. His fingers traced the line of my chin, my neck, pausing at the curve of my shoulder with a pressure that was simultaneously restrained and entirely declared, as though he knew exactly what he was doing, and knew that I knew, and that was enough. "You can leave," he said against my mouth, his voice rough and his eyes dark. "If you want," I answered by pulling his tie. The city outside went on existing. I forgot about that for a few hours. When the narrative reopens, it's dawn, the particular kind of still dawn that follows things that change something, with the muted glow of the city filtering through half-drawn blinds, and the apartment in silence, and me in the kitchen wearing Luca's shirt on my shoulders, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I'd brewed because sleep wouldn't come and I didn't mind. His voice drifted from the living room, low in Italian, carrying the business cadence he maintained regardless of the hour, as though the world hadn't paused a few hours ago and resumed spinning on a different axis. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the rhythm, and there was something unexpectedly intimate about hearing Luca Savio work on the other side of the wall while I stood in his kitchen wearing his shirt. The intimacy of it lodged in my chest for a second, before I decided not to examine it. He walked into the kitchen and stopped mid-sentence in Italian. The pause lasted 2 seconds, long enough for me to feel the weight of his gaze before I lifted my eyes from the cup. He stood in the doorway, phone still in hand, wearing an expression I'd never seen on him, not the man who commands space effortlessly, but the man who had just encountered something he wasn't expecting, and was quietly recalibrating around it. He ended the call without a goodbye. "You stayed," he said. It wasn't an observation. It was something closer to wonder, the subdued wonder of someone who had learned not to expect certain things, and who, when they occur, doesn't immediately know what to do with them. "You didn't ask me to leave," I said. "No." A pause, his eyes on me with that total attention as always, and then, "I never will." There was more in those words than their surface could hold. A promise that hadn't been dressed in ceremony, that hadn't asked for anything in return, delivered with the same plain directness Luca Savio brought to everything, and that was more than enough. He crossed the kitchen and stood beside me at the counter, close enough for me to feel the warmth radiating from him, and glanced at the cup in my hand with that barely there curve at the corner of his mouth. "You found the coffee, but not the bigger cups," he said. This one was a product of trial and error. How many trials? 3 cabinets. He reached above my head and opened the 4th, the one I hadn't gotten to, and drew out a larger cup without comment, setting it beside mine with that silent precision that was his particular form of care. He said nothing more. He stayed next to me while the coffee brewed, his shoulder touching mine, and the silence between us was the quietest and most complete silence I'd inhabited in a very long time. Chapter 9. She's not leaving. "You are." A week had passed since that dawn in his kitchen, and what existed between us had taken on a shape I still lacked official language for, but recognized with my whole body, the shape of something real, built in layers, that refused to fit any category I'd ever used to name what came before. I'd returned to my apartment. He hadn't asked me to stay longer, and I hadn't volunteered, because we both understood without discussion that certain things need room to settle before they're given a name. But he called every night, not with purpose, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes an hour, and there was in those calls a quality of attention I was learning to identify as Luca Savio's highest form of saying he was present. Wednesday morning his phone rang during the coffee we were sharing on his balcony. I'd come back, which was a piece of information about myself I was still digesting, and he answered, listened in silence for a few seconds, then said only, "Where?" in a voice 2 degrees colder than usual. He hung up, looked at me. "Derek is at my office," he said. I didn't learn the details immediately. I learned them because Luca called 40 minutes later, while I was at my own desk attempting to focus on a deadline that had ceased to matter the instant his name appeared on my screen. "Pick up and don't speak," he said when I answered. His voice was quiet, not his ordinary quiet, but the specific quiet of what I'd come to call cold operational mode. "Just listen." There was the ambient sound of a room, footsteps, and then Derek's voice, which I identified before my brain registered that I was identifying it, carrying the tone he used when he believed he was negotiating from strength. "You do understand she's using you, don't you? Scarlett is talented at that. She looks solid, looks like the woman you want beside you, and then you realize it was always about what she needed. She wants status. She wants me to regret it. You're her instrument, not the other way around." Luca's silence, brief, heavy, the kind that precedes something unavoidable. "And you came here to share this with me," Luca said, with a neutrality so total it was more intimidating than fury would have been. "I came because I think you deserve to know what you're dealing with, and because, let's be honest, you're going to tire of her. Everyone does. When that happens, call me. There's room to renegotiate the debt on different terms." The silence that followed was unlike every silence before it. It was the silence before the full stop. "Let me be clear," said Luca, and his voice had dropped another degree, to the point where every word carried the weight of something irreversible. "She is not currency. She is not anyone's instrument, least of all yours. The debt you owe me will be settled on the terms that were agreed, without renegotiation, without concession, and without her name surfacing in any conversation that touches my business. And you will not appear in the same space as her again, in any context, under any circumstance." A 2-second pause. "This is not a threat. It's the end of this conversation." The sound of a chair, footsteps, a door. Luca returned to the line. "Did you hear all of it?" I was standing in the middle of my office with one hand braced on the desk because I needed something solid, and the voice that came out lacked the composure I was reaching for. I heard, "I'm coming to you. You don't have to. I know I don't have to." A brief pause. "I'm coming anyway." He arrived in 20 minutes. I'd spent those 20 minutes closing files, straightening my desk, and standing at the window looking down at the street, trying to organize what I was feeling into a structure I could name. I couldn't. I gave up the attempt when I heard the door. Luca stepped in, shut the door behind him, and stood looking at me with that total attention, not checking, but the attention of someone who has arrived where they were headed and is entirely present now that they're there. I didn't move from the window right away. "You didn't have to do that with me listening," I said. The speakerphone. You could have told me afterward. I could have, he agreed, but you wanted me to hear it. I wanted you to know it was said. Not just that it happened, that it was said. In those words, in that order. He was quiet for a beat. There's a difference, and there was. I knew there was, and the fact that he knew I'd understand was the thing that made me leave the window and cross the room toward him, not rushing, not hesitating, with the 2 or 3 direct strides of someone who has made a decision and is executing it before the mind can build a case against it. I stopped 1 step away, raised my eyes to his face, and there was the same expression I'd seen in the kitchen at dawn, the quiet surprise of someone who had trained himself not to expect certain things and doesn't quite know what to do when they arrive. What am I to you now? I asked. It wasn't a trap. It was the most honest question I had. He looked at me for a long moment, that complete, still gaze that read what I wasn't saying, and then spoke, his voice low and without detour. You're the only person I ever changed a plan for. A pause, and the only one I'd change every other plan for. Without calculation, without condition. That landed inside me in a way that couldn't be absorbed with poise, so I didn't attempt poise. I simply went to him, hand on his jacket lapel, deliberate this time, no pretext of a pocket square or proximity or anything that wasn't pure choice, and kissed him. This time it was me, and he received it with both hands, one open and warm on my face, the other at my waist, with a pressure that felt like something he'd been containing for a while and had just released. And there was in the kiss a different intensity from the first, different from the night before. It was the intensity of something that finally had a name, and knew it had a name, and no longer needed to hold back. It wasn't gentle. It was everything that had been restrained from both sides. The entire week, entire chapters of advance and retreat, and pocket square and silence, and you didn't stay in the plan, and it was enormous, and I gripped his jacket because I needed something to hold on to. When he pulled back just far enough for me to breathe, his eyes were dark, and his hand was still on my face, and neither of us had stepped away more than necessary. She conceded, he said after a moment. I needed a second to register he meant Madison. The case? Resolved yesterday. Sophia's custody transfers to me by court order. Madison signed the agreement early this morning. I stared at him. And you didn't tell me before now? I was waiting for the right moment. And the right moment was this. The right moment was when you came to me. The faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. It seemed fitting. I laughed, and he watched me laugh, and his gaze held the same quality as always. Cataloging, present, complete, but with an added layer I hadn't seen before, one I recognized as Luca Savio's version of happy, which was quiet and direct, and exactly the right size. Clara was in the reception area when we walked out, sitting in one of the waiting chairs with a coffee in hand, and the expression of someone who definitely isn't waiting for anyone in particular, a physical lie of remarkably low quality by her standards. I needed the in-person context, she said, not standing. How did you know I was here? I asked. Because you always come to the office when you're processing something big, and this morning you sent me a message containing a single exclamation point, which in our language means critical situation unfolding. Luca glanced at me. 1 exclamation point. It's a system, I said. It's an excellent system, Clara said, finally rising and extending her hand to Luca, with a formality that lasted precisely 2 seconds before she added, I know everything. Since the bar. Since the pocket square. I just want you to know I've been in your corner since the first video call, and if you hurt her, I have enough contacts in the legal world to make your administrative life profoundly unpleasant. Clara, I said. That's a fair warning, Luca said, his voice entirely level. Thank you, said Clara, satisfied. Welcome to the family. She was out the revolving door before either of us could respond, coffee in hand, carrying the posture of someone who had completed a mission. I stood looking at the door for a second before turning to Luca, who wore that expression I'd spent weeks learning to read and now recognized with precision. It was the expression of someone who, for the first time in a long time, was not calculating the exit. Sophia had called me for the first time on a Thursday afternoon while I was at the office, a 7-year-old voice that was direct and unceremonious. Are you Scarlett? Uncle Luca talks about you. And I'd been so disarmed it took me 3 full seconds to respond, which she interpreted as permission to continue. She told me about school, about the math teacher who was extremely annoying, and about the pet dog she wanted for her birthday, that Uncle Luca was pretending he wouldn't get her, but that she knew he would. When I hung up, Luca was standing in the office doorway wearing the expression of someone trying not to show he'd been monitoring the situation closely. She called you, he said. She called me, I confirmed. What did she say? That you're going to give her the dog? A beat of silence. I haven't decided that yet. She decided for you. The smallest curve at the corner of his mouth. She's exactly like her father. I knew in that moment that I was lost in a way that wasn't lost at all. Months later, I still woke sometimes with the particular strangeness of someone not yet accustomed to her own happiness. That 1 second of open eyes in the dark, when the mind checks whether what surrounds it is real before allowing itself to settle. The apartment was his, which had become ours by slow accumulation, and without decree. My things materializing in drawers and on shelves in a progression neither of us had planned, and neither of us had interrupted. His phone rang in Italian in the living room at 7 some mornings. I learned where the bigger cups were without needing trial and error. Life hadn't become simple. I didn't expect it to, and Luca had never promised simple. He'd promised real, whole, and unconditional, and that was exactly what we had. There were meetings he couldn't share with me. There were cases of mine he couldn't follow because of conflict of interest. There was the constant presence of a world that was his and that I was learning to occupy without losing the outline of mine. It was work, the kind of work I'd never done inside a relationship before, because I'd never believed it was worth it. And the difference between this and everything that came before was that here, I wanted to do it. What I didn't say, what I had chosen not to say, was that some secrets don't stay silent simply because you refuse to speak them. They wait. And when the man you love was built on truth, the lie you keep from him is exactly the size of the wound it will open. That cycle had ended. But the next would arrive without warning, without a door, without a click, carrying the weight of a secret I kept telling myself I was protecting, when in truth, I was only postponing the inevitable. Lena here, that wraps up Book 1, and I've already finished Book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee.
The ring had been in my pocket for 3 hours, eager for the proposal. I'd rehearsed this without meaning to for weeks. Then Uncle Enzo put his phone in my hand. It was a photo of Scarlett, next to Renato Voss, the man who killed my brother, smiling, with documents between them. I didn't process the words, just the image. She turned when she heard me arrive. Her eyes met mine, and that smile appeared. The smile I knew by heart. The one she saved just for me. My hand closed around the ring inside my pocket. She didn't know what I'd seen, and she stood there, whole, luminous, looking at me as if I were the only real thing that night. This is what she wants you to see, I thought. But what if it was true? I stood there with the ring in my hand, and the photo burned into my head, looking at the face of the woman I loved, trying to figure out if I still knew who she was. She tilted her head. "Is everything okay?" I opened my mouth, and I still don't know what I said.
As you can see, that was just a little taste of Book 2. To watch the full uncensored version, just click the first link in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in just a few seconds. Just a reminder, click that first link down in the comments, and the complete Book 2, ad-free and uninterrupted, will be waiting for you. It's that simple. I'm absolutely loving working on Book 2, and since you guys are loving it too, I promise there's more to come. This is where you'll find stories that get even steamier, true dark romance. And because this version is getting so much more spicy, the video wouldn't be well received publicly on YouTube. This private space is where I can really show my true essence, and where I feel free to do my best work for you all. Keep in mind that the channel has been demonetized. So this is a way for me to keep my team together and continue bringing high-quality stories to you. I'll have even more updates for you soon. I'll be waiting for you at that first link in the pinned comment.